Everyone believes a mafia boss survives by seeing danger before it arrives, by stopping it early, by cutting the wire before the bomb ever ticks. But Lucky Luciano once did the opposite. He saw an assassination coming days in advance, and he let it happen. No sudden disappearance, no reinforced security, no frantic purge of suspected traitors. He stayed exactly where he was supposed to be, moved exactly as expected, and allowed his enemies to believe they were about to change the future of the American Mafia with a single bullet. New York at that moment was not at peace. It was frozen. Families weren't openly at war, but they weren't stable either. Too many grudges, too many old scores left unpaid, too many ambitious men waiting for permission or an excuse to pull the trigger. One assassination could have shattered everything, and everyone knew it. That's what made Luciano's behavior so unsettling. The man who built systems, rules, and balance into organized crime suddenly appeared careless, exposed, almost reckless. Whispers moved faster than gunmen. Word spread that a hit was coming, not a rumor. Certainty. The kind of certainty that usually sends bosses into hiding or sparks preemptive bloodshed. But Luciano didn't flinch. To the men watching him, that silence felt wrong, because in the mafia world, silence before a killing usually means one thing: someone is already dead. Yet Luciano was alive, visible, and doing nothing to stop the clock from running out. Then the shot came. It didn't kill him, but it did something far more dangerous. It forced every family, every boss, every would-be kingmaker to confront a reality they had been avoiding. This was no longer about who could kill whom. It was about who controlled what happened after the gunfire faded. And in that moment, Luciano revealed something terrifying. The assassination was never the threat. The war that would follow was. Because Luciano didn't survive that attempt by luck. He survived because he wanted the bullet to fly. He needed it to. That single act, allowing violence instead of preventing it, would end a mafia war that no one could win without declaring victory, without wiping out rivals, and without firing another shot. And once you understand why he let that assassination happen, you realize something unsettling about power itself. The most dangerous man isn't the one who pulls the trigger, but the one who decides when the trigger should be pulled at all. By the time the assassination plot surfaced, Lucky Luciano was sitting on top of a structure that looked stable from the outside, but was cracking underneath. New York's mafia families weren't fighting openly yet, and that was the problem. When violence stays hidden, paranoia grows. Nobody knows where the next strike will land, only that it's coming. Meetings became shorter. Messages were filtered through more hands. Every favor carried a debt that felt heavier than before. This wasn't peace. It was compression. Luciano understood something most bosses refused to admit. A silent mafia war is more dangerous than a loud one. In an open war, lines are drawn. Sides are chosen. Endings arrive quickly, even if they're bloody. But a quiet war has no finish line. It drags on, rotting the system from the inside. One hit here, one disappearance there. Just enough violence to destabilize everything without ever forcing a resolution. That was exactly the situation New York was sliding into. If Luciano struck first, he would confirm everyone's worst fears. One assassination ordered from the top would trigger retaliation he couldn't fully control. Allies would hesitate. Neutral families would panic. Suddenly, Luciano wouldn't be the organizer anymore. He'd be just another participant in chaos. But if he did nothing, if he simply absorbed the pressure and waited, something even worse would happen. His authority would erode. A boss who knows danger is coming and refuses to act looks weak. And weakness, in the mafia world, invites challenges. Every option led to disaster. Violence meant war. Restraint meant collapse. This is the trap Luciano was facing. Not a question of survival, but of system failure. The structure he had built, rules, commissions, balance between families, could not survive a prolonged stalemate fueled by fear. Something had to break, and Luciano needed it to break in a way that benefited no single family, no single faction, except the system itself. That's where the assassination plot became useful. The man sent to kill Luciano wasn't just a gunman. He was a signal, proof that the old rules were already dead, even if no one wanted to admit it yet. Luciano realized that stopping the hit would only delay the inevitable. Another plot would form. Another shooter would step forward. The pressure would continue building until someone panicked and detonated the entire city. So instead of blocking the violence, Luciano reframed it. He allowed the threat to exist in the open. He let everyone know a line was about to be crossed, not because he wanted blood, but because he wanted clarity. A single visible act of violence, especially one that failed, could do what months of secret killings could not: force every family to confront the consequences of escalation all at once. This wasn't about bravery or recklessness. It was about forcing a decision on an entire criminal ecosystem that had been avoiding one. Luciano didn't want to win a war. He wanted to make continuing the war feel impossible. And to do that, he needed everyone to see how close they were to losing everything. The assassination wasn't the beginning of the plan. It was the pressure release valve, and once it opened, nothing in the mafia world could pretend things were still under control. By the time the hit was set in motion, it wasn't a secret anymore. In fact, that was what made it so dangerous. The plot to kill Lucky Luciano moved through New York like an open wound, painful, visible, and impossible to ignore. Couriers whispered, drivers changed routes, meetings ended the moment his name was mentioned. This wasn't how assassinations were supposed to work. A clean hit relied on surprise. This one relied on inevitability. What made it stranger was the choice of execution. The shooter wasn't a ghost. He wasn't buried deep inside layers of deniability. He was known. Not publicly named, but recognized by the people who mattered. A man whose presence alone told the underworld that restraint had ended. Whoever approved this hit wasn't trying to be clever. They were trying to make a statement. Luciano was no longer untouchable, and Luciano knew all of it. That was the moment everyone expected him to disappear, to retreat into safe houses, to flood the streets with his own gunmen, to clean house before someone else did it for him. Instead, he did nothing that looked like defense. His movements stayed predictable. His routines stayed visible. To outsiders, it looked careless. To insiders, it looked insane. But there was a pattern hidden in that stillness. Luciano wasn't ignoring the threat, he was amplifying it. By refusing to shut it down, he allowed fear to spread evenly across every family. Nobody knew who had sanctioned the hit, which meant everyone felt implicated. And that uncertainty was more destabilizing than any confirmed enemy ever could be. The assassination attempt itself unfolded fast and ugly. No cinematic precision, no surgical silence, just a burst of violence meant to end a reign in seconds. The shot didn't kill Luciano, but it landed close enough to shatter the illusion that the system was still intact. In that instant, the entire mafia world froze, not because the hit failed, but because it happened at all, and that failure mattered. A successful assassination would have crowned martyrs and unleashed revenge. A failed one did something far worse. It exposed vulnerability without offering resolution. Whoever ordered the hit didn't get a body. Whoever opposed it didn't get justice. All they got was proof that the line everyone feared had already been crossed. Luciano survived, but survival wasn't the message. The message was that the rules protecting every boss in the city were now optional. And once that idea exists, it can't be buried again. Every family understood this immediately. They weren't watching a man almost die. They were watching the last warning before open war. That's why the aftermath was so tense. Not explosions of violence, but silence. Long, calculating silence. Because everyone knew the next move mattered more than the shot itself. And Luciano, bleeding but standing, had just gained something no amount of brute force could buy: time. The assassination attempt wasn't meant to remove him from the board. It rearranged the board entirely. And in the space created by that single failed bullet, Luciano was about to make the most dangerous move of his career, not with a gun, but with restraint. To understand why Lucky Luciano allowed the assassination attempt to happen, you have to forget the idea that this was about survival. Luciano wasn't thinking in terms of living or dying. He was thinking in terms of control. At that stage, the Mafia wasn't threatened by one ambitious shooter. It was threatened by a system drifting toward chaos, where no rule was sacred and no boss felt safe. Luciano needed three things, and none of them could be achieved with a preemptive strike. First, he needed proof. Not rumors, not whispers. He needed visible, undeniable evidence that the old balance had already collapsed. As long as violence stayed theoretical, families could pretend restraint still mattered. A real assassination attempt, especially one everyone knew about, removed that illusion instantly. Once a boss of Luciano's stature could be openly targeted, no one could claim the system was still functioning. Second, he needed legitimacy. If Luciano cracked down before the hit, he would look paranoid or self-interested. Any retaliation would be dismissed as power consolidation. But by absorbing the attack, he transformed himself from aggressor into stabilizer. He didn't punish first. He endured. That distinction mattered enormously in a world where justification was often more important than brute force. Third, and most importantly, he needed fear to change direction. Before the shot, fear pointed at Luciano. Men wondered how long he could hold everything together, whether he was losing grip, whether someone else should take his place. After the shot, fear pointed outward, toward escalation, toward consequences no one could control, toward the realization that if one assassination failed, the next one wouldn't stop at a single target. Wives, brothers, lieutenants, nothing would be off limits once the barrier was broken. Luciano understood something his rivals didn't. A failed assassination creates more pressure than a successful one. A death ends a story. A survival prolongs it. It forces decisions. It demands response. And by refusing to immediately retaliate, Luciano denied everyone the release they expected. No bloodbath, no purge, just a dangerous pause. That pause was intentional. In that silence, every family started calculating the same question: what happens if this continues? The answer was obvious and terrifying. Total war wouldn't crown a new king. It would destroy the market, attract law enforcement, and erase profits that had taken decades to build. Luciano didn't have to explain this. He let them arrive at the conclusion themselves. This was the genius of allowing the bullet to fly. Luciano turned violence into an argument rather than a weapon. He used risk as leverage. By standing still when everyone expected him to strike back, he positioned himself as the only man capable of stopping what everyone now feared. The assassination attempt wasn't tolerated out of weakness. It was permitted because it completed the picture Luciano needed everyone to see. Once that picture was clear, the question was no longer who ordered the hit. The real question became who could afford another one. And at that moment, Luciano already knew the answer. After the assassination attempt, New York didn't explode. It went quiet. And in the Mafia world, silence is never neutral. It's calculation. No family rushed to claim credit. No crew moved to retaliate. No emergency alliances formed. Instead, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Meetings were postponed indefinitely, and men who had been loud just days earlier suddenly became unreachable. The city wasn't holding its breath out of fear of Luciano's response. It was holding its breath because no one knew what any response would trigger next. That silence worked in Lucky Luciano's favor. By surviving without striking back, Luciano created a vacuum of intent. Normally, violence clarifies sides. This time, it blurred them. Every family wondered whether the hit had been sanctioned quietly by someone they trusted. Every boss questioned whether backing the wrong reaction would put a target on his own back. The uncertainty spread faster than gunfire ever could because it forced everyone to think defensively at the same time. Luciano didn't reappear as a wounded man seeking justice. He reappeared as a constant. Calm, visible, unchanged. That steadiness unsettled people more than rage would have. A boss who explodes can be anticipated. A boss who absorbs an assassination attempt and then says nothing becomes impossible to read. And in organized crime, unreadable power is the most dangerous kind. Behind the scenes, something subtle began to happen. Messages reached Luciano not as threats, but as questions. Not demands, but probes. Men weren't asking who he would punish. They were asking whether things could be contained. That shift mattered. It signaled that the conversation had moved away from dominance and toward survival. The families were no longer thinking about winning. They were thinking about preventing catastrophe. This is where Luciano's position changed completely. He hadn't declared authority. He hadn't enforced it. He had become necessary. If chaos continued, everyone lost. If order returned, only one man could plausibly claim he hadn't caused the problem and therefore could fix it. The silence after the shot elevated Luciano from participant to arbiter. And crucially, he never filled that silence himself. He let it stretch, let anxiety deepen, let calculations turn into fear. Every day without retaliation increased the cost of escalation. Another hit would no longer look like ambition. It would look like suicide. The families understood that instinctively. By the time Luciano finally began to speak again, the war had already ended in everyone's mind. Not because peace had been declared, but because continuing no longer made sense. The assassination attempt had done its work, and the quiet that followed sealed it. The shot proved the system was broken. The silence proved no one wanted to be the one who broke it further. And standing in the middle of that silence, Luciano no longer needed to threaten anyone. They were already listening. By the time Lucky Luciano moved to formalize what everyone already felt, the war was effectively over, without a single declaration of victory. That was the point. Declaring a winner would have meant declaring a loser, and losers in the Mafia don't accept outcomes quietly. Luciano understood that ending the conflict wasn't about crushing rivals. It was about making the continuation of conflict irrational. He didn't call it peace. He didn't frame it as compromise. Instead, he reframed the entire situation as a problem of survival for the system itself. The message was implicit, but unmistakable. The assassination attempt had proven that escalation was no longer theoretical, and the next round wouldn't stop with bosses. It would spread outward, pulling in crews, families, and attention from outside forces that none of them could control. This wasn't a threat. It was an observation, and that made it harder to argue against. Luciano's move was subtle. He didn't punish the unknown architects of the hit because punishment would reopen the question of sides. He didn't demand loyalty pledges because that would expose fractures. Instead, he imposed structure. Rules that made spontaneous violence expensive. Processes that slowed impulsive decisions. Mechanisms that forced disputes into controlled spaces rather than onto the street. He didn't remove ambition. He redirected it. What made this effective was restraint. In a world built on retaliation, the refusal to retaliate became a form of dominance. Luciano wasn't sparing his enemies out of mercy. He was sparing them because killing them would validate the very chaos he was trying to end. By denying everyone the satisfaction of revenge, he denied them momentum. This is why the war ended without anyone claiming triumph. Every family walked away believing they had avoided disaster rather than suffered defeat. No blood feuds demanded continuation. No martyrdom narratives fueled retaliation. The conflict dissolved not because it was resolved, but because it became pointless. Luciano emerged not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizing force whose authority came from necessity. He hadn't proven he could destroy everyone else. He had proven that without him, destruction was inevitable. That distinction mattered more than any show of force. In the end, the assassination attempt achieved exactly what Luciano needed. It demonstrated the cost of instability without forcing him to pay it. It scared the system straight. And once that happened, the war didn't need to be won. It just needed to stop. History often remembers power as something loud, gunfire in the streets, bodies left behind, enemies erased. But Lucky Luciano demonstrated a far more unsettling truth. The most decisive victories don't look like victories at all. They look like restraint. They look like silence. They look like a man standing still while everyone else panics. Luciano didn't end a mafia war by crushing his enemies. He ended it by proving that the system itself could not survive another step toward chaos. By allowing an assassination attempt to happen, he forced every family to confront the same reality at the same time. That violence, once unleashed, would no longer be selective, profitable, or controllable. And once that realization settled in, no speech or threat was necessary. The war collapsed under its own weight. What makes this moment so dangerous isn't the bullet that missed. It's the precedent it set. Luciano showed that power isn't just the ability to order violence. It's the ability to decide when violence is useful and when it's more powerful to let fear do the work instead. He turned vulnerability into leverage, survival into authority, and silence into command. That lesson reaches far beyond the mafia. Systems don't fall apart when leaders are challenged. They fall apart when escalation becomes unavoidable. Luciano understood that stopping a war doesn't require winning it. It requires making continuation unbearable for everyone involved. So the next time history presents a conflict that ends without a clear victor, without a final battle, without a formal surrender, it's worth asking a different question. Not who pulled the trigger, but who decided the trigger should never be pulled again. Because sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one with the gun. It's the one who knows exactly when to let it fire and when to let the silence finish the job.